Thank you so much. Thanks, Miriam. And thank you for letting me come and join you this evening. It's great to be at this obviously very active Republican Women's Club. And Leilani, best of luck to you. With a little luck, next Monday we'll find out that the U.S. Supreme Court will allow the state legislature to actually redraw the congressional lines the way we believe that the U.S. Constitution says. So good luck to you, because there'll be a lot of hard work there, and I'm sure, and I hope everybody in this room will get behind the line and help her out. You know, it was about 230 some odd years ago that in Philadelphia, this very day, that the framers of the Constitution were gathered together in the old State House, and they were discussing ways to amend the Constitution under which they were operating at the time, which was the Articles of Confederation. And as they proceeded on, they gathered there, and they did the first thing that any self-governing body does, and has done for actually probably 500–600 years in the Anglo-American tradition. They elected the president of their self-governing body, and that, fortuitously for all, was President George Washington. And George Washington was president of the convention. So as soon as he was elected, they elected the secretary. That's normal as well. And they did the third thing. They appointed a committee to draft the rules that would govern that convention. That's the way self-governing bodies work today. 99 state legislatures in the U.S. Congress operate that same way. When they get together, the first thing they do is elect their officers, and then they confirm their rules by a majority vote. And what does that mean for a self-governing body? That means for a self-governing body, they can also change those rules and change those officers at any time. That's the beauty of living in a free country that has self-governing bodies that elects representatives to represent the people. So what happened 228 years ago to this day, the Founding Fathers did something that they laid the foundation for something that was unique in the world. And the progress that has happened in this country over those 200 some odd years has been called by one author a 5,000-year leap. They elected 73 delegates from the states did. At the time, 55 ended up participating. The list of the names of those who participated was so august that Thomas Jefferson, when he heard about them, he said this was an assembly of demigods. These were experienced, wise statesmen, and two of our greatest statesmen, however, were out of the country. Thomas Jefferson in Paris, and John Adams was in London. They were representing this nascent country in those two capitals. America was an agrarian nation. It was already split sectionally along the question and controversy over slavery. The states faced trade, paper money, debt, and among other pressing issues. The people were largely religious. In fact, 9 of the 13 original states in their constitutions had state-sponsored religion. While smoldering at the time, the vision of freedom and republic and democracy held by John Adams was distinctly different from that held by Jefferson, but that distinction had not boiled over yet. That would happen when you saw the first cabinet of President George Washington. Those were unique aspects and happened. Now today it's merely a 3-hour drive from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. Back then it took George Washington 5 days to cover that. Transportation was slow, as was communication. It was erratic at the time. Today's Philadelphia is quite a bit different. There are many people in there are as many people in the Philadelphia metropolitan area, in fact a little bit more, today as there were in the entire 13 states combined in 1787. The U.S. is vast geographically and demographically, but our communication infrastructure is equally vast and far more sophisticated, even if it's sometimes erratic. None of the states today have state-sponsored religion. Most of the youth of the nation do not believe in God or are irreligious or say they doubt. Moral taboos from 1787 today are virtually nil. Those that remain are under assault. The communitarian principles that have always proven to be failures and were ignored by the framers deliberately have taken over the world. The growth of government in Washington, D.C., indeed the existence of Washington, D.C., would be actually news to the founders. The surrender of Congress to the administrators of the myriad state agencies have produced bureaucratic, unrepresentative government, such that political scientist Hannah Arendt said, quote, bureaucracy is the form of government in which everybody is deprived of political freedom, of the power to act. That's what political freedom is. For the rule by nobody is not no rule, and where all are equally powerless, we have a tyranny without a tyrant. The delegates to the 1787 convention, they understood that what they were doing was not perfect, that it would need some changes periodically. A mechanism for potential alterations was proposed, and on at least 2 occasions debated, not extensively, but debated during the Committee of the Whole. George Mason, a delegate from Virginia, supported a process for amending the Constitution, but he opposed letting Congress have any role in that process. In fact, that was one of the reasons George Mason did not sign the Constitution. More than a month after George Mason's brief comments, Gouverneur Morris argued that Congress, not the states, should be allowed to call for a convention to amend the Constitution whenever they pleased. Finally, in September, as the Constitutional Convention, 1787 Convention, was coming to a close, substantive debates took place in the Committee of the Whole. There were 2 of those substantive debates. Madison noticed and commented on the vagueness of the terms in the proposed language of what became Article 5. Specifically, he mentioned the phrase, quote, call a convention for the purpose, close quote, as being insufficient for explaining the reason for calling a convention. That is, the phrase failed to adequately explain the parameters of and purpose for the convention. Madison also wondered, quote, how was a convention to be formed? By what rule decided? What the force of its acts? Close quote. His questions are similar to those of opponents of a modern-day convention. His musings indicate that the provision yet needs clarification. In fact, a thorough examination of the minutes accumulated by Farrand, including Madison's, Yates, Lansing, and others, will show that Madison's questions and concerns were never even mentioned, or no attempt was ever made to ameliorate his concerns. As the final debate over the process for amending the Constitution, Madison renewed his complaints. He noted that there might be questions about what form the convention would take, or what would constitute a quorum of the convention. Language addressing Madison's concerns and clarifying the mechanisms of the convention never made it into the Constitution. And those issues remain today. Now, after the Constitution had been ratified by the requisite number of states, New York was still debating. There was a great schism within New York. There was those who were, like Alexander Hamilton, rabid supporters of the Constitution, Hamilton being one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. There was the Clinton machine. Clinton is the guy who managed to get Yates and Lansing as delegates to the from New York to the convention. In fact, New York, ultimately Lansing and Yates left believing that the 1787 convention had exceeded its scope of authority. There was a fight going on. Virginia, so they began agitating for what they called a general convention. Madison was approached by a farmer by letter named George Turberville. I won't read it all tonight to save time, but Turberville wrote asking Madison, what is it? What would you do? What's your feeling about the proposal from New York for a general convention? Now, what is a general convention? Those who are here tonight from Convention of States rely a lot on a guy named Rob Natelson, who is I believe he's a now retired professor from the University of Montana. Natelson talks about general convention in several of his works as not being what we might think of a general convention, that is to say, where you open everything up to consideration. He describes it as being, you invite those to the convention who should be at the convention. In other words, everyone that should participate is there. It's a general convention. Well, Madison goes on and describes this, because what that would be, that perhaps might have been the first convention that would ever have been called pursuant, or the first process for amending ever done under Article 5. The reality is, Madison expressed himself with a lot of concern. He said a lot of the things that I think are pertinent for today. He said his first concern is this: delegates to that convention would certainly believe that their authority exceeded the scope of the call from Congress. He believed that delegates to that convention would act outside whatever the constraints were by the Congress of the time. He then said, you would inspire the most inflamed minds and partisanship. Is there anyone that believes that the Republican Party or the Democrat Party will not attempt to control the convention that would take place? He went on to talk about additional of insidious forces and insidious people who had special interests, who would want to drive a convention to include their special interest and not that of the general welfare. In the end, Madison said, I tremble to think what would happen if we had a second convention, if we had a convention even were to amend the states. Because let me tell you something. He believed that amendments should be pursued now and then. But he also said the 1787 convention was held under the most propitious of circumstances. What does propitious mean? The best circumstances you could have. Chaired by George Washington, an assembly of demigods, the capacity to hold meetings in quiet deliberation. There was no texting, no tweeting, no emails. There was no demand for media to come in. This guy would not have been allowed to be in there with his camera. And they kept it secret, so sacred that they believed was their oath of confidentiality, that we did not find out until the minutes were produced much later that people like Alexander Hamilton wanted to basically obliterate the states and have a monarch as our executive officer. Or that James Madison felt like the sovereignty of the state should be further curtailed. That is a propitious circumstance. What do we have today? We have a circumstance where none of the outside environment is conducive, and we have a persistent demand for transparency. Transparency, so there cannot be discussion or debate of what people truly feel. Because Alexander Hamilton, can you imagine him today standing up in a convention saying, I think we should have a king. We should have a monarch. And we should get rid of the states. We couldn't have that. Well, I want to cover a few things because I know Dustin, and he and I've watched this song and dance before, so I know kind of what he's going to say. But I want to talk briefly about what's contained in Article 5. Article 5 basically says that Congress, those are the first two words of it, they have a role, it's legitimate. Whenever on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, where they're asking for some kind of convention for proposing amendments ostensibly. When the 2/3 come in, then guess what? Then the Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. And then those have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So it isn't a convention of states. What it is the process. And the first process is applications or petitions. The second part is Congress. Now, you've been given something that says that 34 states submitted applications for a convention dealing with the same subject. There is nothing in the Constitution that says same subject. It merely requires 2/3 of the states to apply for a convention to propose amendments. There is no specificity, there is no direction, for even in the minutes of the Constitution. In fact, it gets right at the heart of Madison's concerns. There is nothing that says what those petitions even need to look like. But as soon as you say that Congress has the authority to determine what the content of those applications are and what's valid, you move beyond a ministerial function. You move to a substantive participatory function. Right now, for instance, if I turn in petition signatures at the Secretary of State's office, they have a ministerial duty to accept those. They count them. That's all they do. That's a ministerial function. If there's any question, now that you have a substantive function, and an independent arbiter, a judge then determines. But ostensibly, when you say this here, you're saying Congress now exceeds the authority which may or may not be given in the Constitution. That's important to consider. Because the next statement that you'll see on this little card is that Congress must set the date and time for the start of the convention. It has no other discretion. And yet, by their very argument from the first bullet point, they have just said Congress no longer is limited to a ministerial function. And if you don't think Congress is going to attempt to exceed whatever bounds they think that they're able to set, then you just haven't been watching for the last 50 years. The next point is the convention drafts language for proposed amendments on the topics specified by the state applications. One state, one vote. There is nothing in this Constitution that says that will be a limiting factor. There is nothing in there. Again, that's what James Madison was talking about. And James Madison went on to say, he said, you know what? We really should be doing something more as a body, as we provide directions for constitutional, if we're going to act as good constitutional creators. Madison, in the minutes. One state, one vote. Where does that come from? Ostensibly, I would say that they must be thinking that because in the original convention that was what they agreed to. But why did they agree to that? Because they were operating under a constitution that required one state, one vote. That is not what we have today. Our Constitution is different. I would suggest to you there will be debate and argument. Do you think a state such as California or Texas or Florida or Ohio or New York that has an incredible amount of electoral votes, for instance, is going to secede that authority, cede that authority, and say, we are willing for Wyoming with 500,000 people to have the same vote as we in Florida with 32 million, or Texas with 29 million, or California with 36 million. That is hard for me to conceive that that's true, especially when there's no direction in the Constitution. It goes on to say, when 38 states ratify an amendment proposal, it becomes part of the Constitution. That is the one thing I agree with. When you get 3/4 of the states to ratify, that's great. But guess who determines what method is necessary to ratify? The United States Congress. They determine. They say it's either going to be the state legislatures or the states will have a convention. That is a tremendous power, because I will just close with giving you a homely example that I think touches on a lot of concerns I just have. You may recall the Medicaid expansion debate right here in Arizona. Just a few short years ago. I was the Senate president at the time. I was given a call, hey, come back, the governor's just called a special session. I went in, the first thing they wanted to do, a coalition of 13 Democrats and 4 Republicans against 13 Republicans. The 13 Republicans said, we don't want the expansion. The 4 Republicans joined with 13 Democrats and said, we're going to oust Mr. Biggs as the president, and we're going to elect somebody else. They decided then that would be intemperate, that there might be political ramifications, so they didn't do that. But when we went to the floor, because they didn't control the floor, because they had the majority, the first thing they did was suspend every rule of the Senate. Right here in our state, a red state, a solid red state. They did it in the House of Representatives as well. They suspended every rule. They took over a bill and they said, we no longer are required by rules to have committee hearings on this bill. We're no longer required to send this to the Rules Committee to see if it meets constitutional muster. We do not have to have debate on the floor. That they then passed out with 13 Democrat votes, 4 Republican votes, versus the majority of 13 Republican votes. Why do I bring that up? Because I've seen a runaway convention, a runaway self-governing body firsthand. I know exactly what happens. It is no longer a rational body. It is a body full of emotion. And they can suspend the rules. And that's just I'm gearing my comment primarily to the Convention of States because Dustin's here. I could talk about the myriad other proposals that are out there, whether it's the Compact of States, I think one's called, a whole host of others. It's a very fractured group. But one thing I would say too is, it isn't just conservatives or Republicans who want a Convention of States for those who are moving it. The far left also. John Paul Stevens, former justice, you would call him. He has 7 amendments. One of them is to eliminate or the death penalty. Another one's to basically emasculate the Second Amendment. There's a group called Wolfpack, funded by George Soros. There's a group called Code Pink, funded by George Soros. The point is, there is no way to constrain this. Recently, Justice Scalia said it would be a horrible idea to have a constitutional convention. Then he said this: the less done to the Constitution, the better. And I think, am I about out of time? I got 2 minutes left? Okay, great. So I'll just go on about this. So the reason my book is called The Con of the Con is because I think, look, I'm not trying to attack anybody. I've taken their points and I've said, this is why I think this doesn't make sense. But sometimes there's spin used, and when spin is used, it's a con. Justice Scalia is speaking to a Tea Party group. He is asked, at the question and answer period, do you think a constitutional convention is a good thing? He says, no, I think it's a horrible idea. This group that you're going to hear from tonight put out a press release saying, well, see there, we agree with you. A constitutional convention is a bad idea, but what we're proposing is just an amendments convention, because you could never have a full constitutional convention, because that means that you're going to write a new constitution, kind of like what they thought wouldn't happen in 1787. But what we're going to do is we're just going to amend the Constitution. And so we're different. So Justice Scalia can't be talking about this. But the very idea of this convention, the reason it's called the Con by me, and it was used for 30 years, Constitutional Convention was what it was called, to amend the Constitution, until it became associated with kind of a negative connotation. So then it was remarketed as Convention of the States, Compact of the States, and several other things. But I'm telling you, if you read the article from the reporter who was there, you'll understand, and you put it in context. Justice Scalia is talking about an Article 5 process. And so I've always wondered, so if you disagree with Justice Scalia, just say, hey, we disagree with Justice Scalia because we think X, Y, and Z. I think that would be the better way of doing it than to try to gloss over and say, he can't possibly be talking about what we're talking about. Well, we could go on, and you're going to hear some things, and I don't think I get the last word. And so, as a former trial lawyer who's now in a repentant mode, and has been for many years trying to repent from all that I did as a trial lawyer, I will just close by saying the same thing I used to say when I wasn't going to get a second kiss of the pig or a second bite at the apple. Dustin's going to say things that I would love to rebut. I'm not going to have time to rebut him directly because we're going to go to questions and answers. So I'd ask you to just try to remember what I said and see if they apply to some of the things that Dustin's going to say. Dustin's a man who's sincere, he's well studied. We just simply disagree on this. And other than that, I think we probably agree on probably 90% of everything else in the world. Well, with that, thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much. Dustin Romney. This right here. Just out of high school, he served a mission for his LDS church in Washington, D.C., and it was during that time that he developed a deep respect and appreciation for the founding era of America. Eventually, that developed into a near obsession with constitutional history and law. He also earned an MBA from Arizona State University. Awesome. After 9 years teaching and coaching, he decided it was time to pursue his real passion, which turned into 6 years of research that went into his book, Rule of Law. He's also Director of Education for the Convention of States project in Arizona. And he's married, and I thought I might have this wrong, 2 kids? 2 kids. Let's welcome Dustin Romney. Everything else in his bio was related to the Convention of States specifically, so I thought I would rather have him speak to those issues rather than myself read it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. That's all right. I had to do a lot of padding of my my resume because it's not that thick yet. Senator Biggs is on his way out of the legal profession, and I'm actually on my way into the legal profession. I'll be starting law school in the fall at Arizona State. So I keep telling people that I'm trying to be an anti-lawyer, not a lawyer, so don't hold that against me. Thank you, Senator Biggs, for your remarks, for your kind words. I'm honored and a little bit humbled to stand up here shoulder to shoulder with you and debate this important topic. I hope that I can live up to it and give this important topic its due credence. Just a little bit of a humor. You may have noticed today that another Republican declared for the presidency. It's getting a little ridiculous. I was waiting for Senator Biggs to make his declaration. So just take a moment. Is there anybody in here that wants to declare for the presidency? It won't be me, so I think we'll be okay for the next 20 minutes or so. And actually, the idea of choosing a president is kind of a good lead into what I want to talk about tonight, which is federalism. And a lot of us, I think, have forgotten that actually the method of choosing a president was intended to be controlled by the states. They were to choose the electors that would choose a president. And that was an important part of federalism. And the method that we have today of choosing a president is quite a circus. And that's exactly what the framers were trying to avoid by the method that they chose. And ultimately, that's why I'm part of the Convention of States. That's why I'm here, because the problems that our government has are deep structural issues. They're constitutional issues. And only constitutional amendments can fix those problems when it comes down to it. And I agree with Senator Biggs that there are pitfalls. There's no question. We haven't done this, at least to the extent that we want to do it, since 1787. And we don't know what the pitfalls are. There are question marks. But at the end of the day, it's a simple risk-reward decision. And we simply feel that the reward is worth the risk, and the risks are actually minimal. But back to what I really wanted to talk about, which is federalism. I want to start out by defining federalism and why it's so important for our country. Federalism is a system in which a national government and subnational governments are equally sovereign over meaningful and unique responsibilities and possess effective means of checking the actions of the other. Federalism is an effective way of ensuring that governments remain small, efficient, and less prone to abuse. And this has been confirmed by modern economic research. There's 2 main reasons federalism works. First is the concept of intergovernmental competition, which functions much like the competition we all see in a free market. The Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, the OECD, and the International Monetary Fund, not exactly havens of limited government philosophy. In fact, the IMF just today implored our Federal Reserve to keep on printing more money and not to raise interest rates until 2016. So these are organizations that are not limited government people, yet their economists have found research that have shown that federalism's system of government competition improves the efficiency of public service delivery, makes taxes flatter, hampers government's redistribution efforts, makes government smaller and more responsive, and reduces public sector costs while raising the quality of services. And again, that's not the conservative talking points of a Republican presidential candidate. That is modern economic research from more liberal-leaning economists. The second reason for federalism's success is locus of control. The reason subnational governments are more responsive is because they have fewer people to respond to. Smaller jurisdictions tend to have more homogeneous populations, which also leads to greater trust of the public sector, and that greater trust leads to better accountability. So what about our Constitution? There's a lot of elements in the Constitution that deal with federalism, that strengthen it, but I want to focus in on three of the Constitution's major components of federalism. The first one is enumerated powers. Keeping the federal and state governments separate is essential for the system to work properly. If either takes on the responsibilities of the other, then having both state and federal governments would be a redundant and inefficient waste of resources and would lead to the abuse of power. This is why the 10th Amendment was adopted, and it is why the states adopted the Constitution only with the understanding that federal actions beyond enumerated powers would be invalid. Had they understood the Constitution any other way, they would not have ratified it. The concept of enumerated powers, however, unfortunately, as we all know, is totally dead. Supreme Court decisions, mostly during the FDR era, authorized Congress to spend and tax on whatever issues it saw fit. The states, rather than independently managing its own programs, are now merely administrative arms of the federal government. The Constitution's first and probably most important buttress for federalism, enumerated powers, is gone. The second thing, state representation in Congress and the executive branches. Since it was the states which created the federal government, it would be the states, directly and indirectly, that would choose 3 out of 4 of the federal government's bodies. The states would choose the senators directly, the electors would choose the president, then these two bodies would choose the Supreme Court, which would interpret the limits of the federal government's power. The states' ability to decide who convenes in the Senate and who sits in the White House put the states in a position to protect themselves against federal encroachments on their powers. But once again, unfortunately, and as we all know, the state's voice in the federal government has now been totally silenced by the 17th Amendment and by the ceding of electoral votes to a popular decision. As these two critical components of federalism, enumerated powers and the state's role in choosing the Senate and President, have been eliminated, it is no wonder that we have an enormously inefficient and wasteful centralized government. Rather than the Senate and President standing as guards against nationalist impulses, they have become totally complicit in the promotion of massive federal programs which have zero basis in enumerated powers. So what remains of federalism, and how can we strengthen it to reap the benefits which modern economic research shows it to have? The Constitution's third critical component of federalism is Article 5. The state's monopoly over constitutional amendments. In spite of the state's significant role in choosing the federal government, throughout the constitutional ratification debates, the fear was constantly expressed that the states would eventually be consumed by the federal government. The Federalists, those fighting for ratification of the Constitution, repeatedly referred to this third component of federalism, Article 5, as a powerful means for the states to maintain a proper structure and separation between state and federal governments. Federalism can only function properly if both governments have an effective mechanism to check the other. Although the Constitution would be the supreme law of the land as stipulated in Article 6, Article 5 gives the states the supreme authority to revise the Constitution itself. Federalism quite simply would have been incomplete without this provision. The Article 5 convention process for adopting amendments independent from Congress is the Constitution's capstone on federalism, and it is an inspired and essential component of the Constitution's system of checks and balances. Unfortunately, it has been neglected and far underappreciated. But I believe we ought to take the Federalists at their word. If all other checks in the constitutional system fail, as they obviously have, then Article 5 must be invoked in order to revitalize federalism and thus limited and more responsive government. Now, as we heard, we must understand that these problems are systemic and have no political solution. No conservative majority in Congress can overturn the 16th and 17th Amendments or the Supreme Court's numerous misguided decrees. Voting for a new set of senators and president using the progressives' democratized system will not do. A broken vessel cannot be renewed by pouring in new wine. It is time for a restoration of the system, not simply a change in guard. This reveals just how crucial Article 5 is to the longevity of our nation. We are the only nation on earth which I am aware in which subnational governments can tame the central authority. In most other nations, as in Europe, if the government gets out of hand, you're stuck with it. A mechanism to change government without its permission, without starting a war, and without having to rely on a corrupt special interest democracy echoes the core character of American-style federalism. And in light of our current circumstances, surely must have been inspired. An Article 5 convention is the last and best mechanism to breathe life into the federalist system our founders gave us, and we must use it. Now, as we've heard, there are a few conservatives who are afraid to use the convention process. The loudest complaint against using Article 5 is the runaway convention. The fear is that the left wing will somehow overtake the process and steer it in their direction. Now, it is true that there is no guarantee that the convention will go smoothly, or even that it will produce the best amendments that we could hope for. But what is also true is that the likelihood of dangerous left-wing amendments getting ratified as part of the Constitution is a virtual impossibility. Let's examine why. Article 5 allows Congress or the states to propose amendments. Because it already exists as a deliberative body, Congress can propose amendments on any subject it wants at any time with a 2/3 vote. It is essentially an open convention. In order for the states to propose amendments, 2/3 of them must agree on a subject and then call a convention which makes the specific proposals. In either case, the proposals must be ratified by 38 states. Which of these two methods is more dangerous? 2/3 of the states or 2/3 of Congress? Congress can constantly pass legislation which is novel under the Constitution, think Obamacare, and it can actually propose constitutional amendments on any subject at any time. If it were so easy for the left to pass radical amendments, why have they not done so through Congress? In fact, they've tried. There are amendments that have been proposed and are awaiting approval right now to repeal, or in some cases to reword the Second Amendment and to give Congress the authority to regulate campaign finance. Why have these not been ratified or even proposed? Because they don't have the votes. Why would anyone believe that these votes would magically materialize in the event of a state-led convention, especially when Republicans control 31 state legislatures? The states control the process from beginning to end on all substantive matters. If a Democrat-controlled Congress can't get dangerous amendments passed, then why would Republican-controlled states allow dangerous left-wing amendments to pass? A convention is not to be feared. It is simply a deliberative body, agents of the state legislatures coming together to propose changes to the rules governing the federal government. We have a much greater cause to fear Congress and the President. Congress and the President control an army, police forces, prisons, regulatory agencies, budgets, taxes, in addition to the ability to propose amendments on any subject and to force constitutional changes through regular legislation, which is then rubber-stamped by the courts. On the other hand, a convention cannot make law, does not control an army, cannot spend or tax, and indeed cannot do anything binding on the country. All it can do is make proposals. The ultimate choice of what becomes part of the Constitution rests with the political authority in the states. We have held numerous conventions and interstate meetings since the founding, and not one has resulted in a so-called runaway. And perhaps we'll have more time to discuss whether or not 1787 was a runaway convention. But you all have a handout that's circulating here that details the history of conventions. I encourage you to look at that. Meetings between national governments, which was the model used to craft Article 5, constantly take place and do not result in runaways. Any international agreements are always subject to the approval of each nation's political authority, just as the convention's proposals are subject to each state's political authority. Numerous commissions have been formed to propose solutions to various problems such as the 9/11 Commission and the Simpson-Bowles Debt Commission. These commissions met, deliberated, then submitted their proposals to the political authorities to choose whether or not to act upon them. Now, we can debate the effectiveness of these commissions, but it's important when we're talking about the effectiveness of something, that's a difference between whether or not something should be tried or attempted as a means to bring about reform. These commissions didn't devolve into chaos, they weren't overtaken by George Soros, and they stayed true to the purposes for which they were called. This is precisely how a state-led convention functions. Convention delegates are properly referred to as commissioners, and we have no reason to believe that they will not act in good faith, just as other commissioners have done. It is true that once convened, the convention cannot technically be controlled. They will make their own rules, they will choose their own officers. But the safeguard rests in the fact that the states have chosen who goes to the convention. To control who attends a meeting is as much control as one could exert over that meeting without actually being there. But in fact, the state legislatures will be there, as it is the legislators themselves, particularly the ones who lobbied the most for a convention, which will likely make up the majority of commissioners. These will be the last people on earth to steer the convention toward a left-wing agenda. Can we control Congress's agenda? We vote for Congress, but when it convenes, it is free to consider whatever legislation it wants, choose its own rules, choose its own officers, propose whatever constitutional amendments it wants. Why then would relying on Congress for reform be any safer than relying on the convention? I was chosen to come to this meeting and asked to speak on Article 5. I have the microphone, so technically I can start speaking about whatever I want. I can take this anywhere we want to go. What's to stop me? But I'm not going to do that because I was vetted, somebody knew of me and my book, or had heard me speak before and thought that I could fulfill the purpose for which this meeting was called. Similarly, the commissioners at the convention will have been vetted and chosen on the basis of their background and beliefs, which will necessarily be consistent with our application's agenda of limiting the federal government. A convention does not happen unless 34 states make the same call. No, there is no textual basis for that. It is simply a practical requirement. If I ask you to have a meeting with me, and you tell me what about, and you don't want to have a meeting on that subject, you are not obligated to go to that meeting or to give your assent to it. It is the same thing with the state legislatures. They do not have to agree from a textual legal standpoint of the Constitution, but it is simply a practical matter. That means that at least 66% of the convention commissioners will have been chosen by states which are dedicated to limited government. At least 66%. Am I running low on time? Okay, I'll have to skip it. Nations do not fail because of political procedure. Nations fail because they spend, tax, devalue their currency, and regulate too much. If the USA fails, it will not be because we walked into an Article 5 bear trap. It will be because our government spent too much, and we were too afraid or too unwilling to take bold steps to stop it. If the political consensus exists to overthrow liberty, then the political procedures we choose aren't going to make a difference in the long-run outcome. Senator Biggs has said that he would support an Article 5 convention under the right circumstances. Let's examine those circumstances real briefly, if I might. The American system of federalism and enumerated powers has collapsed. Unfunded liabilities stand at well over $100 trillion, as possibly as high as $200 trillion. Federal agencies continue to increase regulatory burdens and are becoming increasingly intrusive, levying fines, issuing threats, and confiscating property with no due process and the assumption of guilt rather than the assumption of innocence. Government will continue to spend and will reach unprecedented proportions in the next 2 decades. At the same time as all of this, we are witnessing an upswing in limited government philosophy. Republicans control 31 state legislatures, the most since the 1920s, both houses of Congress, and have a good chance of reclaiming the White House. For the first time in history, Congress has taken steps to actually count state convention applications and our COS application has been introduced in more legislative bodies over a shorter period of time than any other Article 5 application in history. In short, over the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, we seem to have a unique Article 5 opportunity, both in terms of the need for reform and in terms of Republican control that can ensure the safety and increase the chances for effectiveness of a convention. Last paragraph, I promise, we'll be done with that. As far as circumstances go, I don't know what else we could be looking for. Those of us who believe in constitutionally limited government, and we respect and appreciate that Senator Biggs stands firmly in that category, must unite behind a broad structural reform movement. We look forward to the day when we can work with everyone in the liberty movement to bring about that change. But as we dither, government marches on. Thank you.
Would you guys like chairs, or would you prefer to stand? We didn't have chairs up here, but we can get some up. Okay. Don't know about you, but this is such an interesting topic, and I've been hearing about it for quite some time now. And I have so many friends on both sides of the issue, as I'm sure many of you do as well. And both of these gentlemen have so much knowledge related to this and agree on so many of the points and some of the process. And of course, you know, as always, there's always different interpretations of how something should be based on research, you know, looking at the same research and looking at the same evidence that's out there. And so I really appreciate both of you bringing all of your knowledge to us. It's a very, very important topic, and we do really appreciate it. So there's so many people in the room, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. So out of deference to our members and our members' guests, I want to entertain questions from our members and our members' guests first. And then for all of the guests that are here outside of that, hopefully we'll have time for some of your questions. And if not, then our speakers hopefully will stay for a few minutes afterwards. They both have written books, and they can sign books for you. You guys, I'm sure you'll be selling some if you would like to purchase one. Because we want to make this an opportunity for everyone to be able to ask questions and be heard as well. So, Kathy, your hand's been up a couple times, so I'll start with you.
Okay. Senator Biggs, the big fear that everyone has is the runaway convention. And I heard Mr. Romney answer that with the best answer I've heard, and that is that 3/4 of the states would have to ratify. How do you respond to that? You know, that we don't need to fear the runaway convention because 3/4 of the states are going to have to ratify whatever a convention does.
That's a great question. Let me just tell you the first part of it, though. The implication that was given here is that there'll be a lot of control until you get to the convention. Then once the convention's done, anything can happen really, because the delegates can do whatever. But he thinks that the delegates are going to be very carefully selected and fully vetted by state legislatures. Even though out of 99 state houses in this country, 2/3 of them are held by Republicans. Republicans, or at least platform-believing Republicans, don't hold that many houses. They hold a significant number, more than in probably almost a century, as Dustin carefully pointed out. But when you get to ratification, what I believe the other side relies on is the idea that if a proposed amendment is this, that it is wacky, we're going to become a communist nation, well then sure, you're not going to get 3/4 of the legislatures or the delegate conventions in the states to approve it. But that isn't what all of the left or other side's amendments are proposing. There's a whole host of things that I think are problematic.
Sorry, just tell you it's 1 minute.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh yeah. I didn't know there was a time limit for it. I thought we were going to give somebody a toast, and Toastmasters said someone had a toast. Excellent. So I can't finish answering the question. It took me a minute to set it up. It took me a minute just to set it up. The point is, for instance, if it is a Second Amendment type of question where you're closing that, well, there are perhaps 3/4 of the states that would say, okay, that's not a really radical thing, but we're going to do something different with the Second Amendment, or we're going to do something different with minimum wage. These are policy issues, and they are leftist issues, but they're not so radical that there's not a significant number of moderate Republicans who agree with some of those. That could easily exceed the boundaries.
Chance to respond to each question, I assume.
We'll give you a minute.
I'm sorry. No, that was my fault.
That is true. It's very easy for us to sit up here and say, well, if there's an amendment that's going to repeal the Second Amendment, that has no chance of getting ratified. But there always is the possibility that there could be an amendment that's kind of, maybe, maybe not. But at the end of the day, that's part of the American experiment. That's part of the ongoing legislative process. We don't have any guarantees when we go to Congress or go to a state legislature and legislate. Sometimes we pass a piece of legislation, we negotiate, we compromise, we do the best we can, and we let it play. And we talked about some of the constitutional amendments we've seen that would have been passed previously, the 16th and 17th Amendments. We thought those were a great idea at the time. They haven't worked out so well. And so part of the ongoing experiment that is America is being able to go back and fix some of those mistakes and learn from our experience. And Hamilton commented on this in one of the Federalists. I forget which one, but this is, thank you. We can deliberate. Are we going to deliberately form our government, or are we just going to haphazardly kind of go about this thing and let it happen to us? And I think we should grab the reins and take this over and go through a deliberative debate. And all of these federal programs that have developed over the years have just sort of haphazardly been cobbled together, and they haven't really been thought out and planned out. And we need to do more of them, more design.
Wow. Thank you. Right on time. Ruby?
I thought you were saying wow to my answer.
Let me see if everybody can hear. First of all, thank you very much. I'm very interested in this. I'm happy to have you both here to give us your depth of knowledge. My question is to you, Senator Biggs. If you don't approve of this method, what do you think we should do? Because Washington is obviously not going to undo all of the things that they have done that have been so bad for this country.
Well, you have to rely on the states, of course. And that's why we are seeing a movement within the states, Republicans taking over and doing things. But here's part of the problem. It gets to answering your question too, why it's easy for me to conceive that 3/4 would do something that's not consistent with freedom and principles. Because we don't have virtually any governors or any state legislatures controlled by Republicans who are willing to say to the federal government, no, they all say, Arizona says it too, we want your money, we'll accept your control, because we want your money. Because if we don't take your money, someone else will. And what we have to do is we have to continue to educate, we have to continue to get people to vote for conservative Republican candidates, and we can control, until we get there, we're not going to go there. And we need a governor in this state, we need a legislature in this state that will say to the federal government, because I'm telling you, it takes one state to stand up. We said what's happening in Oklahoma over the Common Core issue. What happened? The federal government immediately marched in and tried to slam them down, threatened to take all of their gas tax money, which for Arizona is billions of dollars. We've received that threat. We have to, the key is elections. It has worked. Transformative elections happen, and we need to hold our public elected officials' feet to the fire constantly.
I agree with that, but I think it will take too long.
Well, of course it'll take a long time. We didn't get here overnight. And if you think the Constitution's the problem, then maybe this is your answer.
But we're on a short road to destruction, and I think it's up to we citizens to take back our freedom, our country.
As I actually kind of interesting. Part of the reason I was a little bit late is I was caught up in an article I was reading from a constitutional scholar by the name of Michael Grieve, and he was talking about federalism. And that's one of the things he brought up, that Senator Biggs just said. I'd always ask myself the question, why on earth would the states give in to the federal government? Why did they do this? And the answer is what he just said. The states have really been complicit in a lot of what the federal government has done. And so, and I agree with what he says as far as part of the solution. Yes, states need to stand up. We need to say no to the federal money. We need to use nullification in the forms that we can use it in. But none of that is in conflict with using constitutional amendments as well. There are some things that simply cannot be fixed in any other way. The Supreme Court says the federal government can spend whatever it wants, however much it wants. The only way to fix that is with a constitutional amendment or a Supreme Court that's going to come in and change it. And to me, the one that's more likely, that we're more likely to get, is a constitutional spending cap. So constitutional amendments can fix things that no other process can fix.
This is for either one of you. I'm confused as to if you had a constitutional convention, it would not be one vote for each state, right?
It would.
It would not.
I don't understand how it could be one vote for each state. It seems to me there would be fighting and argument. And I heard your, is it specified somewhere in the Federalist Papers?
Can we get each of you to explain
Yeah,
your
I'll speak to,
reasoning for
I'll speak to
your
that.
positions?
It's one state, one vote, because that's how every convention previous has been. And Article 5 itself was modeled on international agreements. It was modeled on sovereign governments acting with each other. We look at it today with international agreements. When the United States gets together with Japan and South Korea and China to negotiate a trade deal, they don't give China a disproportionate amount of votes because they have 1 billion people. It's one state, one vote. The way that the states operate is much the same. And that's the way that Article 5 was intended to function. That's how it functioned in 1787. That's how it functioned since. Now, I can concede that there's going to be some pushback against that, and it may be a source of contention for sure. But that's one of those questions that we're just going to have to push ahead with and go along. It's not a contention that amounts to, that's a big enough, it's a deal breaker. And again, as I said, it's important to distinguish between those two types of objections, whether or not it's a question mark and it's an iffy thing, or whether or not it's sufficient to say we shouldn't do this. And I don't think it rises to that. But I'll even say this, because I've done the math. Even if the votes at the convention were divided up according to the Electoral College, we would still have a tremendous advantage at the convention as far as Republican-controlled state legislatures. We control right now on a state-by-state basis, I forget the exact numbers, but it is 2/3 or thereabouts of the electoral votes right now as Republican state legislatures. So even if it was, we'd still have that tremendous advantage.
This year.
And next, and likely the next 3 or 4 years, because that's the way that we're seeing right now.
Well, look, the last convention that's cited by these folks took place in 1922. We are almost 100 years removed from that. The original CONCON, 1787 convention, the reason it was one state, one vote was not because of international agreement, it was because the Articles of Confederation called for that convention. And in their call, they basically were operating under the system in place, which was one vote, one state, which was one of the big problems. One of the big problems for Virginia versus Rhode Island, and all the states versus Rhode Island. Today, our Constitution is different. It might be the Electoral College, which you just suggested. Maybe that's the way it works. Maybe not. Maybe it's by the House of Representatives. Maybe, you see, in the old days, before pre-17th Amendment, the states were actually represented in Congress. They're not represented anymore. So if you take that mechanic, maybe it's proportional to the electoral votes. We simply don't know because it isn't told in the Federalist Papers. It's not told in the minutes of the convention. There's no reference to it being according to international law. It's not in the minutes, simply not there. This is simply a contrivance, frankly, to say it's one state, one vote, and that's the way it's going to be.
On that same subject, it says that the convention can be called by 2/3. This is reading out of Article 5 of our United States Constitution. It says it can be called by 2/3. And then the amendments can be ratified by 3/4 of the several states. Doesn't that say that each state gets a vote? I mean, it says it says that ratified by the legislatures of 3/4. But that's a legislature. That's not X amount of votes out of every state legislature. That's, I mean, unless I'm reading from a different constitution, that implies.
I'm sure you can tell you It's a good answer.
Well, no, let's take a look at that. Because it begins with the first two words. The Congress. The Congress. So whenever 2/3 of both, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states. So each state gets to make an application. That has nothing to do with the actual voting. Is there anything in there about voting? There's nothing in this document about voting.
Well, it says it does. It says it can be ratified.
It has to be ratified. There's nothing about within the convention itself. But this is a process. The first process is you have applications. Second point in the process is you have a convention for proposing amendments. Right? There's nothing in here that says each state gets one vote or the most states, the most populous state gets the most votes. It says simply 2/3 apply. And when Congress says there's 2/3, they shall call for a Congress. If something comes out of the convention, see, now we just skipped the step. What happens in the convention? Right? It doesn't say. That's the point. To simply say, oh, it's one state, one vote, it doesn't say, because when we're talking about ratification, different process. 50 states having ratification. It's either in Congress that says what it is. It's either the legislatures or a convention. But there's nothing in here that says what happens between the application and the call itself, and the ratification process.
Wouldn't that be fun to see that?
If you like watching a demolition derby.
But Senator Biggs, you said that it is all one process.
No.
Article 5 stipulates the entire process. At first, for calling the convention, it's 2/3. Each state gets one voice in that, and for the ratification, each state gets one voice in that. It's not proportional in those. Why would it all of a sudden switch to a proportional system during the convention, right in the middle of that process? That just doesn't make sense.
Well, let me answer that question. Thanks for asking that question. Here's why. James Madison himself said, we are not saying what the quorum should be. We're not saying what the convention should look like. He said that is a problem with at that time it was a proposal number 19. It eventually became what became Article 5 of the convention. He said, this is the problem. It's not defined. So we can say, well, yeah, this part is, but I'm telling you as an attorney who looks at law and legal verbiage constantly. That's what we look at. That's what we live for. You don't have any direction. You have no direction.
All that are answers.
Thank you. So I think we're all thoroughly confused. Do we have a means through Article 5 or not is my question. But some things that we definitely have to look at, that John Adams said that our Constitution would work for moral and ethical people, and religious people, excuse me, right? Which right now we're steering away from that. And then Einstein's definition of stupidity was doing insanity and stupidity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I think, Senator Biggs, we've gone that route, and it's just left and right. We're getting elected officials that are being called off, even the last one, for trying to bribe and hush-hush money for $3 million. It's like, what do you suppose that we would do to move forward?
Okay, so that was, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I will give an answer because that's my nature. I'm going to say that you believe that the Constitution is the problem. And I simply don't believe that. No, wait a second, because you said, well, then I don't get what your point is. Because if your point is the Constitution is not the problem, then what you're saying, then, and yet we need to amend the Constitution. I don't know if you're saying that.
The people are the problem right now.
Exactly.
Exactly. And
Exactly.
and so in light of that, in history, we were giving Article 5 to correct that if it ever got so out of control, and we're out of control right now.
Article 5 was given to make correctives in the Constitution itself. It was not given to be a corrective to the behavior of an immoral, irreligious people. It simply wasn't. So how do you correct it? You do what you're doing here tonight. We're here debating policy in the government. And I know a lot of people say, well, we need to do something quick. It's going to fall apart. We're going headlong over the cliff. It didn't get there overnight. It took forever. And I want to tell you the transformational change that occurred because of a vote. In 1976, we had a president of this country that began ruling in his own way and creating something called the misery index. The crime rate was in excess of 20 points. This guy was destroying this country. We were in an incredible malaise. And what happened? We responded as a people in this country, and we voted a transformational president. In 1979, when I announced that I was a conservative in any college campus, I was ostracized by everyone. Guess what? In 1982, 83, and 84, after Ronald Reagan, everybody who was running for office said they were conservative. Because if they didn't, after 1984, they ended up like Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. Bill Clinton ran as a conservative. There are transformations that take place because of the electorate. I believe in this people. And I believe that if we keep rippling the pond, we're going to see a change. And so I just fundamentally disagree that the Constitution is somehow the problem.
I fundamentally disagree with that as well. I've often used this analogy that if we look at a broken down car, when a car is brand new and shiny and it comes right off the factory line, it's flawless. There's nothing wrong with it. But when the car is used, it gets abused, people eat in it, it gets crashed, there's fender benders, and after 225 plus years, we're looking at a broken down, dented up, outdated thing, not because of what the framers did, but because of what we have done to it over time. And we can't change that by just changing the driver. We want to have the best drivers we can get in there. That's a given. We always want to elect the best people we can get. Nobody's debating that. But we got to take the car back into the shop and get it fixed. Having an effective government is not just about having effective leaders. You have to have effective laws. That's what the entire process of having a government is about, is having effective laws. And we're letting Congress and the legislatures in the states pass thousands of laws for us, the people. It's time we pass some laws for them to follow and then get enforced on them.
Michael?
Thank you.
This will probably need to be the last question. I don't know how long these answers are.
I'll try to make this brief then. Arizona passed Prop 122, which basically, as I understand, told the federal government, you're responsible for your excessive spending. I kind of look at this as a medical condition. You know, we have cancer, and you know, there are different ways to treat it. I would submit that the Congress currently, which they could easily do, audit the Federal Reserve as part of that problem and abide by the Constitution, which they're not. But just like someone who's swamped in debt, where's the bankruptcy button for all this? Is auditing the Fed at least a step in the right direction? And then from there, what would you submit if the Article 5 is too much?
You're looking at Senator Biggs. Is that directed to him?
Well, to both. I mean, I'm just offering a more conservative approach rather than radical surgery, so to speak.
Look, the Article 5 movement is not about replacing any conservative effort.
No.
I don't even like to frame it in terms of conservative or not conservative. For me personally, I look at this movement as a really scientific endeavor. It's a political scientific endeavor. Senator Biggs is a political scientist. The science of our government, of our system, is broken. it can't be fixed with political movements like changing a law in Congress, or just having the state legislatures nullify something, or tell, like Utah, tell the federal government to get off our federal land. I'm in favor of all those things, because I am conservatively minded, I'm libertarian minded, I believe in liberty, I believe in limited government. So I'm in favor of all those things. But again, there are things that are wrong with our government that can't be fixed in any other way. Audit the Fed, heck, abolish the Fed, for crying out loud. But to me, one way we can get that done is through an Article 5 convention. Perhaps we could get that, perhaps not. I'd like to see if we can try and do it.
Well, before I answer, so I hope you don't hold me to time before you say this. I just want to thank you for letting us be here. It's very kind of you to let us be here and take so much time and your interest, and appreciate it. And I appreciate Dustin, because he and I have done this before. I have a feeling we're going to ride this pony again together sometime. But let me just say this. When you say that there's a structural problem with the government, what is the governmental structure in this country? It's the Constitution. That is the structure. That's the structure. I would submit there isn't a structural problem. There is an operational problem. There's an operational problem, and that's what we have to cure. And if you say, well, that we're going to rely on the ratification process, I look back at the 16th and 17th Amendments. I said, we trusted the states then, and look what we got. Most of the states adopted Medicaid expansion. Most of the states continue along that path. So when you say we don't need the surgery, I agree. You don't need to cut off the head. I mean, we have a patient who's got a heart attack, and what I'm hearing is a solution of let's do a cosmetic surgery. The person will look good, but it'll still be dead because we're not getting at the root of the problem, which is the operational problem, which are the people that you elect in Congress. I'm going to tell you right now, if you think passing a balanced budget amendment is going to prevent the type of people who are sitting in Congress today from not, as soon as that's ratified, saying, hey, I think I found a hole. I think here's a way to go around. Then you're just dreaming. You have to change us. Fundamentally, we have to change.
With term limits.
Yeah, term limit. A whole other topic.
Yeah, another topic.
Did you want to close? I'll rebut since I got the mic. What the heck? I'll take over. Just, okay, just,
And then I'll let you
How much time here?
just a minute. Continue.
first of all, the federal government doesn't need cosmetic surgery. It has cancer. It's not a heart attack. It has cancer. It's been growing for decades, and it needs to be cut out. So, I mean, we can go back and forth with different analogies, but I also thank you all for letting us be here. I love having these discussions. Ultimately, though, I hope that at the end of the day, we can come together in agreement as people who want limited constitutional government, that these changes have to happen. I believe ultimately, I'm not a prognosticator or a prophet, but I believe ultimately that the convention is inevitable. Whether or not it's going to be forced upon us by some sort of a Greek-style crisis, I hope that's not the case. That's why I'm in this movement, so that hopefully we can do this before that is forced upon us. Because when that happens, I believe we're looking at the possibility of secessionist movements that are serious, that are real, and I don't think any of us wants to go down that path. We can fix this problem before it gets out of control, and Article 5, I think, is the answer to that. But again, we can continue forward with all kinds of other efforts, good legislation, electing the right people, but putting constitutional amendments in place that limit the ability of the federal government to spend. And by the way, we don't have to just rely on the Supreme Court to enforce those amendments. If you're going to look at enforcement as a problem with the new amendments, the Supreme Court enforcing the amendments is part of what's in the Constitution, and that's what we're trying to amend. We can put forward other enforcement mechanisms so that they can be more effectively followed. Thank you all for letting us be here.